Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com.
So greetings and welcome, Zongyuan. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, before we go into our deeper part of the conversation, I do like to ask all of my guests something about their origin story. So it'd be great to know what you studied at university and was it inevitable you would end up in research and policy?
I studied history as an undergrad, and then upon graduation, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do a PhD, but I knew I was interested, so I ended up working for education, a high-tech education company in China, which was later in the big tech crackdown. Or private sector crackdown in China a few years ago. That company was one of the leading company being cracked down, and that company was called a New Oriental Education Company. That particular company was I worked as a tutor to train students how to take SAT, GRE, or GMAT in order to go to study in the United States. And in the process, I realized I really wanted to go. And I took I ended up taking the exam, and I went myself. So in graduate school here in the U.S., I studied international political economy, broadly speaking, because at that time I was genuinely curious about the rise of China and the implications for the rest of the world. And I was thinking, well, if a lot of global trends and major policies were set in DC, is still set in DC. So why not just come to the United States to DC and see how things are happening? And then when I was in school, I realized that a lot of the people in academia, they talk about economic and financial issues, but they tend to have a different approach than people in the market. So through my work and research, I realized that, oh, a lot of people have this thing called a CFA. So what does that mean? So I looked into it. I realized it's a good education process so that I can then I looked into it. I took the test and I got myself basically market certified so that I can understand the linguistics, understand the terminology better. So that's how I ended up where I am.
Okay, that's fantastic. And, quite varied and wide experience. That's really, really helpful. Now, of course, we have to talk about the tariffs and Trump and so on. But given the volatility in policy, I think we just have to do a timestamp here, which is that we're doing this podcast on Wednesday, the 16th of April, just in case, things develop between this interview and the time of release. Now, perhaps we can go to before Trump 2.0. To get a sense of what was your sense of what the relationship was like between the US and China. So we had kind of the Obama Asia pivot, then we had Trump 1.0 where tariffs came in, then Biden introduced industrial policy and became a bit more pointed about attacking certain parts of the sort of the China tech sort of system. So there seemed to be something going on before Trump 2.0, but how did you see that context?
You're absolutely right. Where we are today is not an abnormal, but the trend in terms of rising tensions, especially in the economic and trade area between the United States and China, has been a consistency over the past, I would say, decade. And I would even push this further back to at least 2012. Remember, at that time, the two presidential candidates in the United States were Obama and Mitt Romney. They both ran campaign advertisement targeting China. And at that time, I remember looking at Pew Research survey, a public opinion survey about America's attitude towards China. So I would consider that as a watershed moment in 2013. That was the first time in recent histories that more Americans started to have negative views or unfavorable views towards China than Americans who thought China was better. And if we look at the numbers as of last year, by 2024, more than 80% of Americans thought China or had unfavorable view about China. So I think, the rising trend in terms of how um, Americans, not just in terms of national security issues, but at public opinion level, this has been consistent. And I think this actually does feed into the rise of MAGA's sentiment, not just in terms of blaming globalization, but very pointed in terms of how China and Chinese factories rob American jobs and devastated American communities. It's in a lot of ways it is hard to blame things on machine or on automation, but in campaigns, the way that politicians can so effectively uh, blame a pointed target, say China, and it is very effective.
And
I'm
and
not
and and then on the other side, that what during that time, so before Trump 2.0, from 2012 onwards, what was the China view on the US? How did that change? Um, were they just responding to the US, or were they also actively trying to in some way, uh, contain the US in some way?
right. That is a really good question, and I would say that there are at least um, two layers of the flavor there. And the most important layer from my vantage point, and perhaps very, to a large extent, underestimated, is continued enthusiasm among Chinese people, Chinese entrepreneurs about America. And despite we see foreign ministry or on Twitter, folks talk about it doesn't matter what if war is the U.S. government wants, whether it is tariff war or any kind of war, we are going to fight to the end. Forget about all that. Let's put that aside. If you just ask a random Chinese people on the street today, they would still have a lot of enthusiasm about America. And I would just give you like one quick comparison, if you allow me. People talk a lot about China's unlimited partnership with Russia. But there is very, very little, you barely hear anybody saying that I'm going to send my kids to study in Russia. Or Chinese students genuinely say, I want to study in Russia. They do not want to. In fact, they still want to come to study in America. And that speaks a lot about, the people-to-people relationship, at least coming from the Chinese side. But when it comes to official side, that is slightly more complicated. On the one hand, with the current leader, President Xi Jinping, sitting on top, the concentration of power as well as his view of the world in terms of unseen changes in 100 years. And now you also have from the Obama administration going forward to Trump, the first administration of Trump and of Trump 1.0 and then Biden and then now Trump 2.0, the narrative about China being a competitor and the definition of China being a strategic competitor for the very first time in 2017 during the first Trump administration, basically become this narrative that China is not just a competitor, but a systematic rival or a pacing threat to the United States. And this is also the lens that Beijing or Chinese leaders, the government, view how America or the American government views China, or for that matter, more specifically, the Communist Party of China. So I would say there are at least two levels. The official level and the people level are different.
Understood. And now, of course, we've had this massive escalation since so-called Liberation Day in early April, where Trump initiated large tariffs. There's been obviously a couple of U-turns here and there and delays and so on. But one question, perhaps we can start with, how do you think China has responded to this? Obviously we get a lot of attention on every moment of Trump, that he sends. There's a lot of focus on that. But how's China responded? What is China's strategy?
Broadly speaking, I think China's response so far has been very calculated, but also very constrained. It's a calculated, constrained reaction. On the one hand, it reacted on the other hand, they also leave space for further escalation, but also signaled that they are willing to negotiate. In fact, just as of last week, the Chinese government issued a white paper discussing China's positions on several issues in U.S.-China economic and trade relation. So that white paper concluded with a section talking about the U.S. and China can resolve differences through negotiation, through mutual respect. And I think that is very interesting. On the one hand, it subtly says this is not, if the United States continue to treat China this way, there is not going to be any channels for discussion. And then on the other hand, as long as the United States treat China with respect, they are willing to negotiate. But I think putting that aside, a lot of people tend to think that China's reaction or retaliation is about face saving. I think there is a lot about face saving, yes, for sure. But I think it's more than that. There is, at a personal level, at President Xi Jinping, or for that matter, his generation level. His generation was it was born in the 1960s. Or even earlier, right? And that generation lived through, the Cultural Revolution and a lot of man-made disasters. So from that is the generation who are willing to eat bitterness, make personal sacrifice to achieve or advance the grander strategy or grander goals designed or preferred by the party and the government. And that is also the generation who raised the one-child generation. And the one-child generation is the generation who grew up in a ever more prosperous China. Tomorrow will be better. And that was also the generation who just suffered COVID lockdown, which would be the first time the one-child generation experienced a major shock, not just in terms of life, economic uncertainties, but also emotional scar. So at personal level, societal level, you have this entire society realizing that things could get worse before they get better. So in a lot of ways at a societal level, although people don't like it, trust me, people don't like it. The Chinese government, the Chinese people, Chinese entrepreneurs, they do not want a trade war. But they are prepared in the sense that things may not get better. So at the societal level, perhaps the Trump administration underestimated how much they are willing and prepared to endure pain. And then on the other hand, I'm afraid that the current administration made two mistakes so far. The first mistake is that perhaps President Trump, based upon his personal style, he likes this theatric show in terms of charisma, dealing with foreign head of state in a very highly personalized style, which is not exactly the type of way that how Chinese leaders conduct business. Especially recognizing that they did have bad experience with President Trump during his during the first time when he was in White House. 2017, President Trump visited China, and the trip was considered as very successful. They even reached several agreements, including a U.S.-China bilateral investment fund. It's the joint investment fund was a joint venture between China Investment Corporation and Goldman Sachs. So right after President Trump came back to the United States, concluding the trip, he started a trade war with China. So a sense of betrayal, a sense of uncertainty is not a surprise to the Chinese leaders or technocrat from that perspective. And this time around, not just the 2017 episode, but the episode of Zelensky, and the way how the current administration conduct or announce tariff and the come and go, the pause and the restart, basically expose a lot of uncertainties, and Chinese leaders do not want uncertainties, especially in a uncertainty might end up in a negative flavor. So without a guaranteed positive outcome, a personal high-level summit between President Xi Jinping and President Trump may not necessarily happen anytime soon. So that was the first mistake that the administration has made. The second mistake that the administration has made is perhaps the damage of America's alliance system, especially by escalating tariffs with neighbors like Mexico and Canada, as well as against the Europeans. If the goal of tariff is to stop the influx of cheap Chinese manufactured goods to protect domestic industry, then the United States cannot do it alone. But the administration, I'm afraid, just spent the past 2 weeks, the past 2 months, devastating America's alliance and destabilized America's credibility, or at least the Trump administration's credibility. So from that perspective, credibility, confidence in America is something that takes years, decades to build. But once damaged, it's very hard to recover.
And then on the first point, the mistake that you alluded to, there's a lot of talk about the fact that there's no communication currently between the U.S. administration and the Chinese administration. It seems like there's barely any communication. But on Wednesday earlier today, there was some talk about the need to find some interlocutors between the two. What's your kind of sense on, just from a practical or logistical perspective, how the communication will happen between the two sides?
Right now, I think at least the Secretary Scott Bessent had his phone call with his Chinese counterpart, He Lifeng, in charge of a Politburo member in charge of economic issues. But And on top of that, China just had a new, the Chinese government just announced that they installed a new trade negotiator, and despite a lot of the tensions in the tariff escalation, so I would say it would still take time for the two sides to officially establish or unofficially establish channels of communication. But it would be wrong or inaccurate to say that there are not enough interlocutors, because there are either on the Chinese side or on the American side, at least at track 2 level, non-official capacity. American business people go to China, high-level business people went to China, and some of them just met with President Xi Jinping. So, but the challenge here is that in order to reach a deal, in order for the Chinese president to put his blessings on a deal negotiated by technocrat, by the expert, we need the American side to have the right people as well. Right now, I think the new administration still they have not put in place all the deputy assistant secretaries or the assistant secretaries or undersecretaries. So it's hard to think about who would be the right person to negotiate on behalf of President Trump's or the administration. And on top of that, we constantly hear people talking about the President Trump's preference to be personally engaged in such negotiation, whereas that is not how President Xi Jinping, he's not going to be, his way of leadership is, or for that matter, the leadership of China or of the Communist Party of China, is that we keep a comfortable distance or even aloofness, such that their appearances is more about at least through the length of Chinese state-owned media, they are supposed to be the carrying leader, guiding the strategic direction, not engaged in day-to-day negotiations. So the logistic challenges are remains, but I'm also not certain that the administration can easily assemble the right people to negotiate, because right now we just, the national security advisor, a lot of uncertainties within the current administration, especially given the interesting mix of people who have different positions on China. The China hawks versus non-hawks, versus people who tend to think that we should prioritize our interest in Asia Pacific. So we are not exactly sure how this is going to play out in the United States first. So despite the logistic challenges, I would say we still need to figure out the right people, because after all, in trade negotiations, or for that matter, in bilateral relationship between two countries, it's not the countries that shake hands or sign deals with each other. It's not the countries, it's people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier, the other mistake the US made was to ostracize its other allies as well, where potentially they could all, align together against China. On the flip side, though, China, while it does have some allies, amongst the bigger countries, it's had more of a fraught relationship. So the China-Japan relationship obviously is very tense. Japan's suspicious of China. The relationship between Europe and China has been deteriorating as Europe is getting concerned about its own industrial base. So, and even Korea as well. So there's a lot of distrust even within Asia towards China. And so the question then is how is China thinking about its possible alliances with the other countries across Asia and around the world?
Right. Although in Chinese foreign policy, sort of the grand scheme, China's position has always been no alliances. Like, we don't join any alliances with any country. That's sort of since 1940, since the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And by the way, yeah, that lesson was because of the fallout with the Soviet Union, right? So, but in recent years, I think a lot of Chinese scholars have been making the case that the Chinese should have an ally, and they have been making the case that a lot of developing countries or countries who does a lot of trade with China, instead of joining formal alliances with security implications, China has been broadening its economic and trade relationship, even with countries that have territorial dispute with China. And one such example would be Vietnam. And you're absolutely right. Recent development would be Korea and Japan, especially in the context of trade tension. Right before the Liberation Day announced by President Trump, the economic and trade ministers of China, Japan, and Korea, they got together in Seoul to talk about how to navigate through rising protectionism in international system. And they talked about how to collaborate on sensitive issues like export controls, supply chain security, and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, China recognized the rising protectionism against cheap Chinese export. But then at the same time, these three countries, for example, they are not countries enjoy comfortable relationship. China and Japan has a lot. They has a tense, not just in terms of border dispute, but history issues. And a lot of us still remember how the Chinese government mobilized the Chinese consumers to boycott Japanese goods or Japanese cars. So putting this, if we talk about this in the context of rising tensions, trade tensions in particular between the United States and China, I would emphasize two things. The first thing is that this, for the Chinese government, this is not a surprise. And the second part is that the United States is not the only country concerned about the influx of cheap Chinese goods. Now, let me sort of allow me to elaborate a little bit more on the first point. They are not surprised, because they are not they are not surprised. Part of the reason is because in the past few years, even during the Biden administration, U.S. officials had talked with their Chinese counterpart a lot. about China's overcapacity challenges and how that is devastating, not just for trade, healthy trade relationship, and how that is not good for the Chinese economy. And then on the other hand, Chinese government also realized that rising protectionism is going to hurt Chinese export. And in order to avoid or mitigate or cushion the domestic implications of shrinking export, they need to boost consumption, household consumption. So in a way, I'm afraid that for better or worse, President Trump's aggressive tactics against China, at least on the economic front, sort of forced the Chinese government to take measures to boost the domestic consumption rather than delaying it. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, the United States is not the only country impose tariffs on China. The Trump administration might be doing it in a very unusual way, but they are not alone. Think about it. Since we're just talking about China and Russia unlimited partnership, the Russians imposed tariffs on Chinese export, and so was Brazil. So from that perspective, and just one other point of numbers, right? As of last year, members of the World Trade Organization filed over 190 unfair trade practice investigations against China. And the majority of those filings were from developing countries. So it's not just the United States. And I'm afraid that from so far, one important reason why the world's two largest economies got themselves into a rising trade tension that neither wants or the rest of the world cannot afford. The reason we were here, I would say part of that is because of the fear of China's overcapacity challenges, how that is going to devastate domestic industries, hurt local communities. And the Chinese officials, up until now, they haven't really shown any sincere willingness to address China's overcapacity challenge. So, I would say it's not like there is deeper reason for the rising protectionism in the global system.
And following on from that, I suppose one way people are looking at this is like a game of chicken, or game
Yeah.
theory sort of
Right,
perspective
right.
that who's going to win or who can win. Some people say, okay, China is going to win this trade war because they're a communist party. They don't have electoral sort of problems. They think long term. They control supply chains, and then the other side is no, the US will win this because the US has a much bigger economy, ultimately has more allies around the world, whether whether it's going through some tensions around currently or not, and then also the fact that China relies a lot on exports, so the US has the biggest domestic market, and that's really was very precious. So I mean, how do you think about that when it's framed in that way?
Um, I I just do not think there is going to. I don't think thinking about who is going to win from from the trade war is the right way of thinking about it. I just think it's wrong. Like there is not going to be winners from a trade war or rising tariffs. That imposing tariffs on Chinese import basically means as American consumer. Every time I go to a grocery store or go to a go to Target, go to Costco, whatever I'm going to buy is going to become more expensive. And for American manufacturers, this is bad because people didn't realize that over 50% of America's import from China are like manufactured inputs. In other words, if the goal of a tariff is to make America's export more competitive, I think that is the wrong way to do it. Because how can you make America's export more competitive, meaning cheaper and cheaper than even, say, the Chinese? How could you do that when A, you increase the cost of your inputs, B, the labor market is going to be more competitive, wages are going to be up, and C, the use of land and electricity and a lot of stuff the prices are going to go up. So from that and If we couple these three aspects with a potential weakening of the US dollar, that becomes a little bit uncertain, because the argument can be made that, well, a weakening of the US dollar might help America's export more competitive. But hey, you did not realize weakening dollar means your import becomes more expensive. So I just do not think that's the right framework to do it. But to think about it, instead, there is no winners from trade war, and I think the Chinese government got it. They talked about how, and this is not the first time. In fact, back in 2018, during the first round of trade war, Chinese officials talk a lot about this same sentence that they are using today, which is, no, there is no winners from trade war. That's that's what they are saying, and I tend to agree. And obviously, the Chinese cannot win from it. Think about it. About 19% of Chinese GDP comes from export. Now, put that in historical context. People might say, well, this is the almost 1/5 of Chinese GDP growth. But the Chinese GDP growth was more reliant on export, say a few years ago, up until 2006, 2007, export contribute to about over 1/3 of Chinese GDP. Now, if we take this even further, around 2021, when China first joined the WTO, export share of China's GDP was almost the same as where we are today. So what has changed is not necessarily to say the Chinese economy becomes more reliant on export, or the value of Chinese export has decreased. In fact, a lot of these factors has to do with the GDP. The denominator has grown exponentially over the past 20 years. And if we can put this in terms of the driver of China's export, don't get me wrong, the Chinese economic growth model has been export-driven, even today. But if we further look at who drives export, the majority of Chinese export comes from small and medium-sized enterprises who employs or generating over 80% of employment inside China. And guess what? Their profit margin as of last year, the small and medium-sized enterprise, the profit margin of them was barely 5.1%. That basically means even if 10% of tariff, they are not going to be able to suck up the cost. So from that perspective, China knows that shrinking export market would lead to a lot of domestic consolidation among these small and medium-sized enterprises, because they are because they are so export reliant. And this is going to result in factory closures, rising unemployment, and so on and so forth. Now, the biggest domestic challenge about declining export is in the rise of unemployment, especially among the youth. Before the Chinese government changed the way that they do statistics on youth unemployment, the number was around 20%. That doubles the average of OECD. And rising unemployment, of course, is bad news for domestic social stability and so on and so forth. And that is the biggest concern of the Communist Party of China. The Chinese government spend more on domestic security than on national defense. So that's how much they are concerned about rising unemployment as a result of factory closures due to shrinking export. So they know they cannot benefit from trade war.
I mean, when you sort of put it in those terms, it seems like China is going to undergo some quite significant challenges, with this potential unemployment problem. I mean, what measures can they take? Because if you look at what they've done over the last few years, of course, they had that huge fiscal boost after the GFC, which turned out to be sort of quite wasteful. Then they've had to deal with the real estate bubble, and recently they've been very cautious around stimulating the economy. So do they have the ability to be able to stabilize the labor market?
I would say that the massive 4 trillion renminbi stimulus during the global financial crisis, it generated short-term benefit, but also created long-term pain that China is struggling today. And one such long-term struggling, one such negative consequence is overcapacity. And that was also the background when President Xi Jinping in 2013 launched the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. When he talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, he talked about the need of using domestic market to solve the need of using international market to solve China's excess industrial capacity. We've invested so much money in steel, in concrete. Now we need to find a market overseas. And given that China's traditional major trading partner in Europe, in America, their economy was slowly recovering, they need to find more customers. So that was the broader context of the Belt and Road Initiative. So up until then, the thinking is still finding more export markets. And you see this similar trend continuing up until this year. And I would say if we take a look at the the March National People's Congress and the government report this time, this is the first time in writing that in government report that Chinese officials, Chinese authorities put boosting domestic consumption ahead of investment in the so-called new productive forces or technology. This basically means they realized that they have to make the change to boost domestic consumption, especially household level, in order to stabilize the economy by consuming at home such that Chinese factories can stay open, such that people can still go to work. And in a lot of ways, we are not going to see Chinese government doing stimulus through direct household checks. They are not going to do it. And for three reasons. The first part is that there is no numeric measure by which the Chinese government can comfortably say, this is the income level, household income level that we are going to give below which we are going to give stimulus checks. Part of the reason is because the income inequality and wealth inequality inside China is just so big. Rural-urban divide is dramatic, and the gap between rural-urban divide, although it has stabilized, but the gap is still very, very wide, not just in terms of income level, but also in terms of consumption level. So that's the first reason we would not do stimulus check, because there's no standard. We have been talking about trying to figure out a income level, but we have been talking about it, but we haven't done anything specifically to laying down the ground. And then the second reason they would not give household check to stimulate the economy is because the Chinese household, as we talked earlier, they just endured COVID lockdown, even among the younger generation, and the more experienced older generation, they were still in the mindset of Cultural Revolution and so on and so on and so forth. So the propensity to save remains very, very high. Meaning, if you give them money, they are just going to put them in the bank in banks. They are not going to spend them. And then the third part is that the more direct, as the Chinese economic growth slows down, and as the Chinese government under Xi Jinping continues to prioritize self-reliance or self-sufficiency, especially in the tech sector, and he needs a lot of government support to boost investment in research and development. Any amount of money diverting away from investment in high tech would weaken that goal. So from that, the 3 points, I think those are the three reasons why I don't think they are going to do direct household stimulus. Instead, what do they do now in order to stabilize the economy and stabilize employment is to align domestic consumption with industrial goals. And if you look at the consumption promotion plan that the government put out, it's interesting that there is one specific section talking about how in what sectors that the government want consumers to to spend their money on in order to build a better quality consumption environment. And these prioritized consumption area include artificial intelligence plus, include aviation, including low Earth orbit tourism. So these are the sectors where I would think, I would not necessarily thought those as a place where I want to, as a regular consumer, I wouldn't think those would be the areas to spend money on. But that's where the government want the consumers, Chinese household, to channel their money in. In other words, they want to mobilize consumers to spend money as a way to subsidize the strategic areas that the Chinese government want to have a dominance in going forward. And then on the other hand, the trade-in programs. We can talk about the limits of the trade-in programs, but I think the trade-in programs is also very telling in terms of how the government want to mobilize consumers to support China's industrial competitiveness. The trade-in programs are in smart appliances, electric vehicles. Those are the places where China already had a huge industrial base, and rising protectionism against the influx of cheap Chinese goods also happened to in those area. So I think it's the rather than using a Western style of direct household stimulus household check, I think the way that the government tried to align consumption with its industrial goals is quite interesting.
Okay. And I noticed that another, aside from obviously boosting domestic consumption, China also, imposed tariffs on US imports, which was kind of expected, very quickly. The other thing China did was it introduced a ban on critical mineral exports, or not a ban, more restrictions, you could say. So, what one retaliation was tariffs, but the other was around critical minerals, which was a general export limitation, not just to the US, but more globally. Can you talk more about that, the motivation behind that, and what leverage does China have in that area?
Broadly speaking, in terms of critical minerals or critical materials that are, if necessary for energy transition, clean tech, and for the semiconductor or electronics in general, China has dominance in the supply chain, not just in terms of overseas access to mining, but also, and perhaps more importantly, in the refining and process capacity. We can talk about this in terms of lithium, in terms of copper, in terms of cobalt, a whole range of other stuff. I think rare earth is slightly different in the sense that rare earth is neither rare nor pricey, because in the whole U.S.-China bilateral relationship, U.S. import of rare earth from China is like is less than 0.1% of U.S.-China trade. And by the way, a lot of countries or a lot of companies have established ways to basically a mechanism of stockpiling. So, but the way that China tries to weaponize its dominance in critical materials speaks to the fact that this is the tool that they recognize that they can use. It's a part of the way that China can fight back. It's also part of the way where when China fight back, at least in the short term, it is very hard and difficult for China's trading partners to find alternative. There would be volatilities in market. So that's one part. But then the second part, I would say, perhaps this round of the trade tension, China is going to be more willing to use this tool than before. And part of the reason is because the rise of the rest of the world recognizing China's dominance and the risk of overly reliant on China as the sole single source of critical materials. So starting from the Biden administration, the United States each started to build this critical material partnership. And in Japan, their vision of economic security clearly defines the supply chain of critical material is the essential part of economic security. And you also see the similar mirror image in Europe and in Southeast Asia. So from that perspective, China realized its dominance and its comparative advantage in critical materials is perhaps only in the short term, as technological advancement allowing for alternatives, allowing for more better recycling. And on top of that, companies and government just build their own supply chain. The China's dominance eventually is going to diminish. So this time around, they are more willing to use it.
And I mean, are there any other types of things like that they could deploy, which they haven't done yet, to increase the pressure aside from tariffs, direct tariffs?
I think so far, up until today, China has demonstrated a whole range of tools that they can use. In addition to tariffs, there are also non-tariff measures. Export control is one, and the other is the other is adding American companies or foreign companies to the unreliable entity list. And China can also use a series of domestic legal and regulatory framework to create a compliance dilemma for foreign companies doing business in China. For example, anti-foreign sanction law basically means that for foreign entities, any entities who are in compliance with foreign rules that are restricting doing business with Chinese entities, that is illegal in China. So if you're a foreign company, how are you going to comply with different jurisdictions? So a lot of China's regulatory or legislative regime basically ultimately at a company level is to create a compliance dilemma. At the end of the day, are you going to be in compliance with China such that you can have access to the massive 1.4 billion Chinese consumers, or you are in compliance with the US, which is the population is about 320 million people, but they are richer.
I mean, so where does that leave someone like the Europeans then? Because they seem to be stuck, between the two, the US and the Chinese. So I mean, how do you think they're going to position themselves in all of this?
I think so far, at least at the European Union level, people are fighting back against President Trump's hectic tariff. And perhaps I would say compared with China, who has been in a de facto trade tension with the United States since 2018. Compared with China, I think the Europeans are not prepared. They are perhaps even blindsided by the rapid rack-up of tariff against Europe. And at the same time, Europe seems to be caught off guard. But there are a lot of agencies at the European Union, as well as individual European members of the European Union. They have also been they have also exercised their own agencies. For example, at the European Union level, they started the very first EU and the Central Asia summit. They started to look at a Central Asia that is in a similar situation, have a difficult relationship with Russia, have a difficult relationship with China, but they also wanted to exercise their own agencies. So this is where you started to see European Union is trying to find other markets, other partners that can provide the much needed energy security need for Europe. And that can potentially also be an export market for major European industrial economies like Germany or France. So from that perspective, we do see European Union finding non-traditional partners, or for that matter, European Union are also reaching out to Southeast Asia as well. So that's one part of the dynamic at the EU level. And then at the state level is kind of interesting, and I think this speaks to the sort of lack of the less coherent part of EU. The Spanish Spanish officials have been going to China, building relatively good relationship with China, and so this is when Chinese officials meet with Spanish officials. They also talked about their view on the U.S. tariffs. Although President Xi Jinping or Chinese officials, the other senior Chinese officials, they haven't really expressed their view directly on U.S. protection, the Trump administration's tariff, but they did talk about this with the Spanish officials. That's a very interesting dynamic. And then at the other industrial giant, Germany, I think since they now just has a new government, a chancellor coming in. I think a lot is in flux. But Germany in general, I would say they are in a very difficult shape, economic wise. But the boost of investment in defense spending probably is going to provide an opportunity for Germany to revitalize its domestic industrial base, especially thinking through the lens of the uncertainties in the Trump administration. But at company level, Germany and China, especially in the auto sector, the connections are still very strong. And the German auto sector is also willing to, or even to a large extent, pioneered of allowing Chinese investment, but set up joint ventures so that the Chinese can transfer technologies to the Germans in order to boost up their own domestic industrial capacity. And I think it's a legitimate argument and logistic approach to revitalize the European industrial base by leveraging China's massive investment in the sector.
No, that's great. And apologies earlier if you heard my dog in the background. Someone was, she was barking away. I did want to ask you about the Middle East. We haven't talked much about the Middle East. I mean, what is China's relationship with the Middle East? Because a significant amount of oil production for the Middle East now goes to China rather than the US because of the increase in US oil production. Of course, we've also had tensions in the Middle East with the Suez Canal, with shipping routes because of the conflict there. And so the US has talked about when they attacked the Yemen, they talked about how, why is the US there protecting the shipping routes from Asia to Europe? So I mean, how does China view the Middle East?
The first and foremost aspect between relationship and the Middle East, especially the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, of course, is energy and hydrocarbon. China's import of crude oil is about 70% of its overall crude oil overall energy consumption, and the majority of those comes from Middle East and Africa. So from that perspective, that's the baseline there. And then the flip side of that, in addition, as the global energy is going through this transformation, the Middle East, especially the Gulf countries from Saudi Arabia to UAE, these are the countries potentially huge customer of Chinese or partner of Chinese solar panels or even nuclear power plants. So from that perspective, the energy interdependencies between China and the Middle East are not just hydrocarbon at this era, but also in renewable or clean energy going forward. And then on the other hand, the second aspect related to energy flow, I would say, is finance, because right now the global market is dominated by oil, and we tend to, at least in the West, we talk about the petrodollar recycling system. On the one hand, a lot of the commodities are denominated in US dollars, the settlement is denominated in US dollar, and then countries in the Middle East or oil exporters, they recycle their dollar by investing in a dollar denominated asset or purchase US stuff, from weapons to something else. Although petrodollar may not necessarily be the preferred terminology that countries in that region wanted to use. It's kind of like having a negative connotation there, but it's sort of, that's the system that we are in right now. And viewing from China's point of view, especially rising tensions with the United States starting from 2008, and then the West sanction against Russian entities to punish President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the seize of Russian foreign asset. A lot of these made Chinese officials recognize the need to protect China from foreign sanctions, the need to reduce China's vulnerability to foreign sanctions. And this is where the Chinese government wanted to push the broader use of renminbi for international settlement, to improve the use of renminbi in the global commodities market, not just in terms of settlement, but also pricing power. And this is where Middle East is very important, not just in terms of oil, but also perhaps even more important in natural gas and critical materials, because oil market is global. There is, it's a global market. It's hard to challenge. Doesn't matter where you are in this one global market. The U.S. dollar is the dominant pricing currency and a settlement currency. But natural gas is different. Not in Asia, there is not a natural gas trading hub yet, and the natural gas market around the world is natural gas markets very much separated. So if China were able to make the renminbi the preferred or the leading currency to settle natural gas trading in Asia, that is a big step forward for improving the use of renminbi in international transactions. And this is the background when President Xi Jinping visited the Gulf last time, I think a few years ago. He specifically talked about the use of renminbi in international commodities trading. And of course, on top of that, he also talked about the use of Enbridge in the context of connecting central bank digital currencies. And of course, Chinese officials also, the People's Bank of China, they have been in conversation with a lot of their trading partners in the Gulf area, or broadly speaking, developing countries, asking countries to expand, for example, Saudi Arabia, to ask their central bank to expand the central bank swap line so that China can, or the People's Bank of China can provide liquidity support or trade facilitations using renminbi. So that's the second aspect. And I would say perhaps the third aspect in terms of security, you're absolutely right. The China's presence in the region, in a lot of ways, benefited from the security guarantee provided by the United States. I'm not sure that the Chinese military presence in the region will be well received either by the region or by the US. But at least there is demand among Chinese companies to have security presence in the area, not just in the Middle East, but in Africa, where China has invested a lot in infrastructure, in mining. The reason is because Chinese entities, Chinese workers, Chinese companies, they oftentimes fall victim to regional instabilities or terrorist attack. There has been demand, and one such solution is that the Chinese government has the provide, or they allow companies to use private security providers to help providing security guarantee. But to what extent the PLA can be directly involved, I'm not sure they have the appetite, and I'm not exactly sure it would be very well received.
Okay, no, great. And just on the dollar more broadly, I mean, you wrote a book about this, but can BRICS de-dollarize the global financial system? I mean, where are we on that path?
Um, I think de-dollarization is different from dethroning the US dollar. I think that's just the baseline perspective that I hold when I write the book, and I still have that opinion. I still have that opinion today. We talk, although a lot of this the movement to use non-dollar currencies for bilateral trade, they are, de-dollarization in action. The more trade and investment is being conducted using non-dollar currencies, the bigger, the more that the U.S. dollar's dominance in international transactions, the centrality is being diluted. But that doesn't mean the U.S. dollar lose its dominant currency position, because right now the number is, like a U.S. dollar dominance, if we look at the numbers, declined from 80% to about 55% in international transactions. But 55% is still more than a half. And that's, if we look at the renminbi, it's gained from like slightly over 2% to around between 4 and 5% these days. But the jump over the past year is mostly because of the China-Russia trade. So I think we have to be conscientious, not exaggerating the nature of the use of non-dollar currency. But if we compare this round of de-dollarization moment with previous, especially around 2008, 2009. I think this time is different because there is more flavor of geopolitical tension and hedging against foreign sanctions, whereas previously countries wanted to use non-dollar currency for economic reasons. The first reason is that, for example, if China is already doing a lot of trade with the rest of the world, it's the largest trading partner for over 120 countries in the world. And for many countries, China is also their largest trading partner. So from that perspective, there is economic reason to reduce currency instability, reduce exchange rate risk, and to reduce transaction costs. Every time you go to the bank to get a dollar, get a certain amount of dollar, you have to pay a fee. So there are legitimate reason to reduce costs, reduce risk for countries to conduct trade and settlement using non-dollar currency with their trading partner. But at this time, especially for China, a country that has over 3 trillion foreign exchange reserves, and the majority of which are invested in dollar assets, the baseline is that any volatility in the dollar market or in the US Treasury market is going to inflict pain on them. And B, they are very conscientious about the potential risk of Chinese foreign asset, or for that matter, China being cut off from the dollar-denominated or dollar-based international trade and investment system, because China is very much export-oriented, very much export-dependent still, and the Chinese foreign exchange reserve, which they consider as not just economic strength, but also a political strength. And I'm quoting former Chinese Premier Zhu Rongji. He said that. So that kind of strength may potentially become a weakness in a geopolitical tension. So now this time they instead, rather than mostly economic reason, there is also a stronger geopolitical flavor to reduce vulnerabilities to sanctions, so that they wanted to broadening the use of renminbi in international trade and settlement and investment.
Okay, no, that's great. I mean, we've covered so much ground. I did want to round off with one or two personal questions. One question I like to ask all my guests is, what advice would you give to young people as they think about leaving university and entering the real world?
Um, I'm not sure if I have advice to give, but I do wanted to say, I do wanted to point out something that I regretted when I was in school. And I wish if I had more opportunities, if I could redo school again, I would spend more time studying mathematics. And the reason is because I realized that it's not just the Asian part of me, but I realized that in the process of studying mathematics is really about a way of thinking, rather than how you are able to do the calculation. It's a systematic way of thinking, how to process information, and I think that is very important, especially now. We are bombarded by different varieties of information. So I think if you are still in school, do more mathematics to the extent that you can. Don't necessarily focus too much about the calculation, but take that as an exercise of thinking. And then the other part that I wish I could do, and I'm doing now, is to spend more time with family and friends. Especially these days, I feel like the part that saddens me the most, and I've said this with a lot of my friends, like we tend to talk a lot about a great power competition. We talk about U.S.-China tensions, but at the end of the day, the collateral damage are normal people like us. These and business people who get a sandwich in between, like we talked about. So I think in time of this, like when news and tensions basically make ourselves feeling hopeless, I think we should spend more time with friends and family, so that even if you are looking for a job, even if you are going through a period of transition, it's always good to have emotional support or provide emotional support to people you care about.
No, that's fantastic advice there. And I noticed you have lots of books behind you. So, what are some of the books that have influenced you over your career?
That's a good question. I think the book that made the biggest impact on me, like at a personal level, is a Chinese book actually. It's in Chinese language. It's called 生命的留言, or a memo about life, and it's written by a late stage cancer patient. In that book, he provided some his thoughts, his reflections about a life relationship to his daughter. So that book was for me. I read that book when I was in middle school, and my father basically gave that book to me as a birthday gift. I think it's a very Asian parents' way of doing things. I think that book basically at a very early age, it made me appreciate life more, even when I face a lot of stress. And it's not about hedonism. It's really not about that. It's about how to uh, think through challenges, how to think through how to treat life one day after another, especially realizing that life is actually so short. I think that book at a personal level really made a big difference on me.
No, it's been fantastic speaking. And final question: what's the best way for people to follow you or to reach out to you and follow your work?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. You can follow me, can contact me directly through my email address. And you can Google my name, and my email address is available on CFR website, Council on Foreign Relations. I do not really have big social media presence, but I do have Twitter, and I also have Blue Sky.
Okay, great. No, that's excellent. So with that, I mean, thanks a lot. It's been a fantastic conversation with you, and you know, I'm sure there's going to be a lot for you to work on as the year unfolds with everything that's going on. So once again, thanks a lot, and good luck with everything.
Thank you very much for having me, and congratulations again for building such an informative broadcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or if you listen to podcasts, leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.